Hello, and welcome to the first of our mini lectures on Chapter 13, where we will be discussing opioids.
So we're going to start by talking about the history of opium use and production, and then we're going to move into talking about the development of morphine and codeine, which are compounds that are related to opium. We'll talk about some of the changes in opioid abuse, the way it's used and the way it's perceived, and then we'll move on to talk about heroin, the supply and sources of heroin, another related drug, and then opioid antagonists. If you've heard about drugs like Narcan or naloxone, that's where these drugs would fit as opioid antagonists. And then we'll talk about the medical uses of opioids, primarily for pain management, the withdrawal syndrome that we can expect when people are dependent upon opioids and then try to stop using them, and then finally opioid overdose deaths, which of course have gotten a lot of attention here in the United States over the past couple of years.
We'll start with opium. So opium, like many of the drugs that we've discussed this semester, is a naturally occurring substance. It is harvested from the poppy plant, and it has been used for over 6,000 years. Drugs that we'll also discuss during this lecture include other kinds of opioids. So these could be drugs that are derived from opium, or they could be synthetic drugs that were developed in labs but have opium-like effects. So the major effects of opioids, relief of pain and suffering, which is where the functionality of many of the drugs is derived from, but they also are known to deliver pleasure and relieve anxiety. So in terms of opium cultivation, here's a picture of the poppy plant here on the right of the slide. The opium can only be collected from that poppy plant for just a few days of the plant's life. People who harvest opium, they make cuts into those seed pods that you see in the photo, and then they collect a kind of a sappy or resinous substance that comes from the cuts. From the substance that's harvested, there are two products that are derived. The morphine, which is extracted from the raw opium, and then heroin, which is then derived from morphine. So as I mentioned, opium has been in use in human civilizations for thousands of years. In Egypt, as early as 1500 BC, we see a description of medical uses of opium. And in ancient Greece, opium played an important role in medicine. Now, in the Arabic world, in Eastern civilizations, opium was more used as a social drug, so not so much for its medical purposes, although physicians did write about its use, and they also described opioid dependence, as well as the problems that were associated with that. We saw the spread of opium to Europe beginning in the 16th century, and also a specific preparation of opium called laudanum. This was a combination of strained opium along with some other ingredients, and it would be taken for nervous conditions, and common to develop dependence on that. If you've read any kind of 18th century style romances or 19th century stories set in that time, you could hear discussions of laudanum, people taking laudanum for their nerves and that sort of thing. There's actually a strong connection between writing and opium as well. The use of opium by famous writers such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. If you've heard of the poem Xanadu, that was written under the influence of opium, and actually even full writings that were about the use of opium, Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater. So again, this wasn't really seen as an illicit drug. Think of it as maybe perhaps the wine of the era, that sort of thing. It wasn't really seen as something that people would be embarrassed about or ashamed to admit at the time. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, we saw a series of conflicts between China and other countries that were known as the Opium Wars. So in 1729, China outlawed the use of opium, but it was not the same thing as its use being stopped. So there's a lot of smuggling going on at the time. And the British East India Company, which we talked about when we talked about caffeine and tea, they were involved in that trade. So it was done legally in India and illegally in China. And eventually, this led to war between the two countries, which was won by England, and that was how they acquired Hong Kong, which recently, only within the past decade or so, reverted to Chinese governance. So we talked about the substances which are derived from opium, and starting with morphine. So this is really its primary active ingredient. And before the early 1800s, when people used opium, they used the whole product. Think about the ways that we've seen drugs become more refined, more potent over time. We see the same process with opium and morphine. So it was isolated on its own in 1806, and it's named after the god of dreams from ancient Greece, Morpheus. And as it's moves through that refining process, it ends up becoming 10 times as potent as opium was. Codeine is also derived from opium. It was first isolated in 1832, and this is actually named from the Greek as well, but for the term for the head of the poppy. So morphine, when it was developed, and its use started to spread, more dangerous because of its higher potency and toxicity. There are really two major influences on its use. First was the technology to deliver it. So morphine was delivered through the use of a hypodermic syringe. So in order to have that injectable form, then we needed to have that equipment readily available. And then also there were some political developments going on at the same time. It was through the used as a pain reliever during military conflicts. So we saw its widespread use in that setting, and that meant that after people were given that as a pain reliever after battle, veterans could return to their homes dependent on morphine. Now this led to this condition, this morphine dependence, being called soldier's disease or army disease, just because of the widespread use in those settings. So moving on to heroin. Heroin was created in a lab. It wasn't refined directly from opium like morphine was, but it was manufactured in a lab. And it was actually marketed by Bayer, the same company that makes Bayer aspirin. So invented in 1874, and then in 1898, marketed under heroin as a brand name. It was meant to be a cough suppressant that was supposed to be non-addictive. It turns out that the non-addictive nature was that was misleading. It was actually 3 times as potent as morphine, which in 10 was 10 times as potent as opium. So you can see the incredible strength of the substance. And as we now know, it can be definitely a dependence-creating drug. So that'll wrap us up for the first of our mini lectures, and we'll be back to talk about the state of opioid abuse in the United States.